Thank you, Ambassador, for that very kind introduction. Let me begin, of course, by thanking RSIS for the opportunity to speak today and for being very flexible about my choice of topics. Originally, I was asked to discuss defense industrial base trends, something perhaps closer to my former U.S. Department of Defense responsibilities than the more general subject that I ultimately chose. I'd be happy to take questions in that area if there is interest, but I would like to use this opportunity to address some broader topics associated with emerging technologies and their impact on peace and stability, not just from a military perspective, but from other perspectives as well. We humans are living in an era of unprecedented risk and opportunity, largely driven by the impact of past, present, and future technological discovery and innovation. I believe that the balance of this century will determine the fate of the evolutionary experiment with large-brained mammals known as Homo sapiens. I believe it is an open question whether or not we are intelligent enough and wise enough to manage our way through the challenges that we face. With a continuously accelerating pace, we humans have been embarked on a journey together where we have been using our intelligence to create technological breakthroughs that give us the means to both dramatically improve our lives and to place our societies at grave risk. Because this process is so exponential, I have had the opportunity to live long enough to have seen much of it occur, and most recently to see new technologies emerging that will add to the stress on our collective civilization. At this point in human history, while we may not all realize this, I believe there is only one human civilization. It is a very diverse collective civilization, and it encompasses a range of forms of government, tribal and religious differences, ethnic and historical context, and perspectives on those who somehow may be different than ourselves. But there is one global civilization now, and we all share its fate. There is no room for isolationism in the world we all inhabit. Let me start with some context on how technology has transformed human history and how it will continue to do so. It was only 2 centuries ago that after millennia of human history, information still moved at the speed of a horse or a wind-driven vessel. It is only a little over 1 century ago that the internal combustion engine and large-scale generation of electricity began to transform lives, businesses, militaries, nations, and the planet that we share. It was almost exactly a century ago that industrialized warfare caused industrial-scale slaughter on the battlefields in Europe and around the world. It was less than a century ago that the advent and the first use of nuclear weapons placed almost incomprehensible mass destruction powers under human control for the first time. Within just the past few decades, the transistor, integrated microelectronics, and the digital revolution have further transformed our lives and all the institutions that we humans have created to conduct our affairs. In my own lifetime, which started in the shadow of World War II, I have seen transformative change and notable achievements. This summer marks 50 years, half a century, since the first man landing on the moon. Advances in medicine since my childhood have all but eradicated diseases that once terrified families everywhere. I've seen the transformation of engineering from slide rule-based punch cards and mainframe computers to being able to hold once unimaginable computing power in the palm of my hand. But I've also seen the disappointing consequences of human intellectual limitations and ignorance. Far too much of the human race still looks to violence to solve its problems. Far too much of the human race, out of ignorance and fear, rejects science, even medical science, to say nothing of climate science. Far too much of the human race is susceptible to misinformation, prejudice, and stereotyping. Into this mix, we are now in the process of introducing a new wave of technologies that will even further transform our lives and our institutions. The effect of these technologies are the greatest technical challenge to peace and stability that we will face, and that is what I will address now. What are these challenges? I'd like to highlight the 3 that most concern me: global warming, which Ambassador mentioned, the rise and resilience of autocratic governments, and the transformation of warfare. Emerging technological advances intersect with and affects, or even defines, each of these challenges. The United States has become politically correct to use the terminology climate change rather than the more accurate global warming I recently spoke with the chief meteorologist of the United States Navy. I asked him his views as a meteorologist on climate change. He thanked me for using the more politically correct terminology. I acknowledged that I had done so, but I pointed out to him the change we were talking about was in fact warming. He was candid that the data clearly supported that description. Every new piece of data I have seen for over a decade supports the conclusion that we are in a race with time against this devastating human-created problem. It is embarrassing to me that my country, which has 5% of the world's population and consumes 25% of the energy generated by humans, is no longer leading or even supporting efforts to combat global warming. This challenge is first on my list because at this point it's the most certain threat that we face, and its effects will almost certainly be devastating. I'm confident that in a technologically sophisticated, tropical, sea-level nation like Singapore, that I don't have to emphasize the importance of addressing this issue. In addition to the threats posed by sea level rise are those associated with mass extinction, weather patterns tightly linked to food production, and resulting mass migration to escape the worst climate effects. Immigration is a major political issue in the United States right now, but what we are experiencing today is nothing to compare what we may face in the future. I can only try to reassure you that the United States is likely to rejoin this battle soon, and in a meaningful way. The technology that permitted fossil fuel-based energy generation and transportation, and the many technical advances that have simultaneously increased the size of the human population, are what got us here. Technology has the potential to at least significantly ameliorate the damage we can expect, and possibly to reverse the dangerous accelerating trends we are seeing now, but only if we make the right investments and political choices. The most obvious technologies to apply are those that reduce consumption and transition to cleaner sources of energy. The shift to electrical vehicles is slowly gaining momentum. While wind and solar can never replace fossil fuels, they can make contributions on the margins. What I've been advocating for in the U.S. political process is a more daring set of investments in technology, high risk, but truly game-changing technologies that are affordable, clean, scalable, and do not have major negative side effects, such as other environmental harm or long-term waste storage risks. On that list are nuclear fusion for power generation, carbon capture technologies, and possibly geoengineering. None of these candidates of which I am aware are sure things. But if even a moonshot approach to attacking a problem on multiple fronts was needed, now is the time. The cost, when you consider the threat, is low, and the payoff could be enormous. I'm hopeful that in the near future the U.S. will once again lead in this area. A year ago, I came to Singapore for a conference on the next wave of technology and its implications for security, the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. The presentation that made the greatest impression on me was provided by a Chinese businessman. It was not about defense per se. It was a demonstration of a surveillance or pattern recognition technology that could, from human images, from film, assess with high accuracy a human subject's mood and temperament, his demeanor, whether the person being observed was angry, content, frustrated, interested, excited, or frightened. There is a lot of artificial intelligence research going on today, and there has been for some time. The confluence of microelectronic-based computing power, advanced mathematics in such areas as data analytics, machine learning, and pattern recognition are being coupled with dirt-cheap and ubiquitous monitoring technology, much of which we purchase and wear or carry as willing subjects of observation and as gratuitous data sources. That provides both corporations and governments with an unprecedented ability to monitor and control populations. Collectively, the tools we are proliferating throughout our societies, primarily to meet the desires of individuals and businesses, are providing autocratic governments with a new and enormously powerful mechanism to control their populations, suppress dissent, ensure that their hold on power is not challenged. There's a lot of money being spent on AI research, but much of it is about solving a single problem: how to understand, influence, and manipulate human beings in order to get them to buy whatever is being sold. Selling more effectively is one use case of artificial intelligence, pointed at controlling or manipulating humans, but it's not the only one. In parallel to the development of what a recently released book calls surveillance capitalism, there is also an effort going on to create surveillance societies. China is leading in the nation-state adaptation of these technologies. The steps China is taking include network-connected glasses that collect data for facial recognition to identify fugitives, the analysis of petabytes of data to determine social credit scores for individuals. They also involve monitoring of protesters for identification and for suppression of dissent, as we saw recently in Hong Kong. This technology is coming of age just as the political appeal of autocratic authoritarian governments seems to be on the increase. And the post-Cold War model of liberal democracy is facing challenges from an alternative model of which China is the predominant example. I just read a fascinating and somewhat frightening book by the former U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, entitled Fascism, with the subtitle, A Warning. In the 20th century, fascism was largely defeated. Fascism's blend of identity politics, exploitation and encouragement of perceived grievances, faith in a single strong leader, and disregard for the rule of law and individual rights seemed once to be in full retreat. The Soviet version of communism, with similar authoritarian characteristics, also collapsed of its own weight. The resistance to and defeat of these autocratic ideas and regimes was achieved despite their ability to use the power of then modern communication tools, such as radio, and police state tactics to control their populations. This century is providing far more powerful technologies for state control and suppression of dissent, including the increasingly sophisticated ability to generate convincing fake news, the so-called deep fakes that are now emerging. We have to ask, how can any internal resistance ever be organized in a state with continuous access to and the ability to process information about every human interaction, connection, or movement that each of the state's citizens undertakes? This is a truly Orwellian prospect. I have no technological solution to offer for this challenge. Our best defense against this threat is to preserve the democratic institutions that we already have, and to find regulatory ways to limit the ability of the state to monitor our every action and interaction for its own purpose. Philosophically, I like to think that I am a product of the European Enlightenment. I believe in human progress. But I am concerned that we are now creating tools that will allow repressive regimes to remain in place indefinitely. History teaches us that democratic forms of government are not inherently stable. Democratic institutions can struggle when asked to deal with complex problems. Large-scale immigration and economic disruption are examples of those sorts of problems. The temptation to surrender freedom and political power to authoritarians promising easy solutions is often too great. Today there are ample signs of this phenomenon, including arguably in the United States. What is new is the availability of emerging technology that will make it virtually impossible to organize and resist authoritarians once they seize power. My career has been largely concerned with the third challenge I will discuss, the intersection of technology and warfare. I'm both an engineer and a soldier, and I have a long and rich background in the development of weapon systems and their use in military organizations. In my view, we are in the early stages of profound changes in conventional warfare enabled by technology. The nations that get this right first are going to have a considerable advantage, at least temporarily. If one looks at the United States conventional force structure and that of most nations, it closely resembles that of the Second World War. It has been said that Dwight Eisenhower or Douglas MacArthur would have no trouble understanding modern military organizations and operational concepts. The building blocks of our modern forces include tactical fighter bombers, mechanized ground forces, and naval forces structured around aircraft carrier task forces. The major changes since World War II include space-based support systems, jet engines, modern command and control systems, precision munitions, especially missiles and stealth. But the basic force structure and the building blocks and operational concepts that we use are remarkably similar. In 1991, in the first Gulf War, the U.S. demonstrated how effective forces in this construct can be when supplemented with modern technologies, such as precision munitions and wide area surveillance. China, more than any other country, seems to have appreciated and responded to that operational model by building a suite of systems designed to defeat the United States' ability to project power. In the United States, we refer to this development in Pentagonese as A2AD, or anti-access area denial. The U.S. is still in the process of reacting to China's extensive military modernization program. But I believe that even more profound changes to warfare are on the horizon and approaching rapidly. The fundamental enabler of this change will be the technologies that contribute to lethal autonomy. And whoever gets this right first, again, is going to have a major operational advantage. I don't believe this change can be stopped. And nations who want the capability to defend themselves will have no choice but to accept the needed transformation. The idea of lethal autonomy conjures up notions of robotic killers with human-like characteristics. That's not what I envision, at least not anytime soon. Lethal autonomy in some form is already with us, and has been for some time. Land and sea mines are lethal autonomous weapons. The Hawk air defense battery that I commanded in the 1970s in Germany had an automatic mode, which of course we never engaged. But technically, we could have turned on that mode and watched the system decide what airplanes to engage, automatically fire the missiles, and assess the results, all without human intervention. A few years ago, I sat in an Israeli tank that had a self-protection system that sensed attacks on the tank and intercepted the incoming missile. The system also automatically and with precision aimed the tank's weapons at the source of the attack. A simple switch was all that was needed to enable return fire, again without human intervention. The U.S. has already moved to the routine use of armed unmanned aircraft in the war on terror, albeit with very tight human control. The U.S. Navy is experimenting with unmanned surface and subsurface vessels. The steps to increased weaponization and autonomy are not dramatic technically. Increasingly, I am seeing international arms shows with offerings of armed unmanned systems. Target recognition technologies and flexible command and control are here or close at hand. The significance of these developments and their impact on warfare are deep and profound. I expect higher levels of lethal autonomy to emerge in ground combat in the near future. There are three technologies that had to be developed to make this possible: autonomous ground navigation, automated target recognition, and automated small unit tactical behaviors. Driven partly by commercial incentives, all of these problems are being solved. In general, it is not a question of yes or no, but of how much is enough to enable autonomous operational capabilities. And as an aside, countries I think like the United States will be very careful about implementing this type of technology. Others will not be so careful. And it will be about, the question that will govern will be how willing are you to take the risk of having unintended casualties. I think for some international players, the greatest risk will be wasting rounds on targets that are not the actual target. And there's a direct trade-off between those two. The advent of these new technologies, implemented in new classes of military platforms and in new operational concepts, will have the effect of rendering obsolete most of the capabilities that militaries around the world rely on today. A reasonable analogy in terms of the impact I foresee was the change from wooden to ironclad ships in the navies of the world in the 19th century. It only took one physical demonstration of the relative capability of ironclads over wooden ships to convince the world of the need for change, and then it occurred very quickly. I believe it is naive to expect international agreements to prevent this transformation. Many prominent people have argued publicly for international constraints on lethal autonomy. I don't think that could be negotiated. I don't think they could be enforced. I don't think they are necessary, and they might even be counterproductive. What I do believe is that international human rights and law of war constraints should be applied to these systems and to the people who field them, build them, and authorize their use. I think that is achievable, implementable, and a necessary goal. Today, the greatest geopolitical problem the world faces is the future of the relationship between China and the United States. Russia considers itself a great power also, but its economic and military potential and the degree to which it poses a strategic threat to others is dwarfed by the relationship between China and the United States. And there is, of course, a military dimension to that relationship. And while as an American I prefer a situation in which the last few decades of American and its allies' preeminence would continue, I know that may not be realistic. Given its aggressive behaviors, however, none of us should prefer a situation where China achieves even local conventional force preeminence. The efficient and effective adaptation of emerging technologies and related operational concepts will be at the center of that competition. On the positive side, the analogy with regard to China to the Cold War is not valid. The U.S. is in a competition with China. We are not locked in a global ideological contest for control of the planet. China is much more integrated in the international system than the Soviet Union ever was. There are problems we must work with China to resolve. First and foremost, global warming. The democracies of the world should work together to discredit the authoritarian model that China represents and advocates. That de facto competition should be played out peacefully through political processes. We do need to act together to limit China's militarily assertive and aggressive actions in the region. There is, however, no fundamental reason why China's inevitable rise should not be peaceful and beneficial for the region and for the world. More broadly, we all must act to understand and address the challenges and changes this century will impose upon us, especially the three I have discussed. Technology is inherently value neutral. How we adopt to and utilize emerging technologies will determine our collective fate, as it has historically. I'd like to close with a quote from Prime Minister Lee's remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue just last month, and with which I strongly agree. The story of humankind's progress has been one of exchange of ideas and continuous learning and adaptation. May that progress continue and continue peacefully. Thank you for your time and attention.